they can hear you, okay? They can hear and see you.
I want to share a few thoughts with you on this Stewardship Sunday around the sermon title, Not Affordable. And after we're done with the sermon, or let me not say done, more or less done with it, because it's always a work in progress, I thought, I should have chosen another title. So bear with me in that sense. I will try and make a logical connection to it somehow. The scripture passage is, one can call it interesting. It's a passage in which we see a very accomplished scholar of Jewish law, and I think quite a brilliant mind at work. A well-educated guy, Paul, a religious specialist, trying to give instructions to his one of his churches, one congregation, trying to address a problem that they were experiencing. Now, elsewhere in the Bible, we read of somebody, I think his name was Eutychus, falling asleep in a window where an apostle was speaking, and he fell out and broke his neck. I think if Paul got going, you better not be seated in the church window, because you will probably also fall asleep. He's got an excellent store of knowledge, I think way too much. I think Paul was also somewhat, perhaps obsessive compulsive. I won't, diagnose him and say he's got that disorder, but you can see he's really into this, and he's belaboring the point and explaining from so many angles that I think the story gets lost in the way. I have a very good friend who's a psychiatrist, and speaking of diagnosis, he always says to me, whenever you're depressed or anything is bothering you, just don't talk to a psychiatrist. And I say, why? He said, well, you will walk out there with at least 4 syndromes diagnosed in you and a bucket full of pills. So to be kind to Paul, let's not diagnose him as obsessive compulsive, but us coming after so many years trying to read into what was happening there and what Paul was saying, I think we should have a look at some of the background, what Paul is talking about here. I think it reflects the difficulties that the communities that Paul was working in were experiencing as this Jesus movement, because this letter was written quite early on, before any of the Gospels. Paul wrote this. And Paul was the apostle of the Gentiles. He, even though he was born an ethnic Jew, but outside of the Jewish homeland, in one of the other Roman provinces, he, being a proper Jew, he also had the experience of living quite a big portion of his life in non-Jewish territory, among people of different convictions and upbringing and different heritage. So when the Jesus movement started and Paul became somebody that associated with the movement, he went at it with his normal vigor, very dedicated, very focused, non-compromising. And Paul, in his activities, had a very very clever approach that he followed, because they were, apart from the temple in Jerusalem and the heartland of the Jewish cultural and religious community being centered there, there were synagogues distributed in different localities right throughout the Roman Empire. So Jewish people would gather there with a synagogue as the center of community life. But because they were situated outside the Jewish heartland or homeland, there were other people also interested in what was happening around the synagogue. And they were people that would associate with the synagogue. Gentiles, not ethnic Jews. Around these synagogues, there was a strict order of preference for people. Jewish men they had, let's say, the ringside seats. They were always allowed into the synagogues and full participants in it. Then there was the space behind them for the women. And behind the women, in the outer periphery, you would find these, let's call them associates or hangers-on. Paul uses the term, and other Christian writers use the term, God-fearers. People who feared or who were interested in or believed in the Jewish God, but because they were not ethnic Jews, they were never allowed to fully participate in the activities of the synagogue. So on this scene arrives Paul with this story about this new rabbi that was crucified, and Paul says, according to the scriptures, resurrected. And he brings the good news, especially for the Gentiles. He brings this message, listen, the message of this rabbi of Jesus is, everybody is radically equal. There is not Jew and Gentile. There is not woman and man. There is not this category or that category. Everybody is radically equal. So imagine this God-fearers, the people that were kept on the periphery, hearing this message of this new approach towards the same message, but now saying, you can be full participants. You can be part of this community. You don't have to keep yourselves away from the center and out of sight, so to speak. Incidentally, some of these God-fearers, the hangers-on, the people on the periphery, non-ethnic Jews, they were some of the best contributors to the synagogues. So they were people that you had to take care of from the synagogue's perspective. And very cleverly, Paul focused on them and drew many of them away from synagogues that did not want to open up the community. So Paul started his own communities for everybody, where everybody's equal. And if you put yourself in the place of a God-fearer, where would you go? You would go and you would take your money with you to where you are welcome and fully appreciated. Now, this long story to come to our passage. What Paul is addressing here in his scholarly, and I don't want to say convoluted, but a very detailed analysis way, is some of the difficulties being experienced as these different groups of people from different ethnic, cultural, and religious backgrounds are merged or attempting to be merged into one community. It is about eating here, which was for Jewish people quite a big deal. It had a lot to do with purity, with holiness, with eating the right things, with preparing it in the right way, and eating it in the right way in the presence of the right people that would not make you impure, so that you had you could not participate in the activities of the community. So Paul was saying to them, in this merging of us becoming this new kind of community, remember, we cannot allow any of our own preferences, our cultural practices, our specific beliefs to get priority over the common good of the community. And on the other hand, we should be aware of and have sensitivity for the specific preferences and cultural practices and beliefs of other people in our community, especially around eating. And Paul is appealing to them and say, do not become a stumbling block to one another. Be aware of and remember that if you associate with this community, no tradition, no cultural practice, no preference should destroy the unity of the community. And the unity of the community is found along the lines of the great commandment, the love of God. And this community should be manifesting that love of God. It should be a practical illustration of the love of God. It should reflect the realm of God, a community, a gathering of people who are one in God's Spirit, and to make their own preferences and individual approaches subject to God's love and to the common good of the community and of the world in that love. I think that is important to note, especially in the time that we find ourselves in. We are still followers of that same Jesus, the same commands, the same call to be that community who makes everything, every conviction that we may hold, every preference we have, any association we have, subject to the good of this community, which should be guided by that law of love, the great commandment. As Paul formulated the guidelines for this new kind of community, he was actually saying, listen, we should be a living statement, a symbol, an illustration of God's love against the Jewish absolutism with the letter of the law dictated and where compassion was so often no longer present. We should be a visual statement against the approach of the empire, of the Roman Empire. We should be that community that Martin Luther King later on called that the beloved community. Today is the day that our stewardship committee designated as the day to conclude our stewardship drive to gather the pledges for next year, where we commit to contribute a certain amount to the life of the church. We may pledge for a variety of reasons, and we may be involved in the church for a variety of reasons. I can think of a few. Let's say, we may say, I enjoy the social interaction. which is a bit on the scarce side these days with COVID. There aren't that many coffee hours or social gatherings of any sort, and the meetings we have take place like this one virtually. We may say I enjoy being part of the church because I love the music program. I want to contribute. I enjoy singing the choir or playing the bells or just doing a solo now and then. And we may say, well, I enjoy being part of an educational program, or I enjoy being part, my child having the opportunity to be part of the excellent youth and children's programs of the church. And we may be willing for a number of reasons, therefore, to contribute to sustain the church financially. And that is laudable. And I'm grateful for that, and I'm sure our stewardship committee is also grateful. But I think it is also time to pause and consider, are we still clear on what the essence of this community should be? All these other things, and I forgot to mention the wonderful work that, let's say, our Board of Missions are doing, and our wonderful social justice work that we're doing. But I think on Stewardship Sunday, it is a good opportunity to take the time and consider our own involvement and assess, are we clear? Are we clear that this should be, in the first place, about reflecting God's love, about being God's love in this world, of being grounded in God's love and being grounded in God's compassion, and striving to make God's justice visible towards one another, and then towards the community and in the world. If we lack that, if we are not clear on that, if we do not understand and fully grasp that we are one in God's love, and that should be what defines us in the first place. And we should be an illustration of that towards one another and towards the world. Then all the beautiful and the wonderful things we do and we enjoy is really not affordable. Not affordable in the sense of the funds that we have to apply to get the result. We filled a truck this morning, not church members only, but also the broader community, with food for people who really need it. It is one of the outcomes of the work of the church. I'm sure that if you really take all the costs involved to park that truck here, in this building I'm sitting in and the building across the green, to maintain that, and the salaries we have to pay to deliver one truck of groceries. It doesn't take a genius or a guy with an MBA to say to you, well, there are probably more cost-effective ways to do it. If we are not united in God's love, if we do not have that spirit of tolerance on the one hand, but also an uncompromising approach to say, We cannot tolerate that which is against God's love, which does not breathe a spirit of compassion and of justice. Then it is also not affordable to try and keep a group of people, a community together so that they can have a coffee hour or some nice social gathering or a Zoom service for that matter. I think one of the outcomes of COVID, with all the negatives that we experience, and I think all of us long for just to see somebody outside your own household without a mask. Like this morning, I arrived and I was looking down where the truck was being loaded and I could identify John Burgess, but Jim Barnes had a cap on and a mask, and I was looking from above. I had no idea who that was. We would love to see our friends, our parents, our children, our grandchildren, as we are used to see them without a mask. Normal stuff that we would like to do. I do think COVID and what we're experiencing with all the tragedy that goes along with it brings for us an opportunity to really assess and evaluate what is important. What should life be about? What should church be about? And on Stewardship Sunday, where we commit to part with some of our means, it is good for us to assess as well. Towards what are we contributing? But more important, from what basis? What calls us, what implores us to make these commitments and these contributions. Let me tell you why I'm pledging, why I still think it is a worthy cause. It's not because I regard myself as this religious expert that can really evaluate stuff in that domain. So, right, yeah, this is kosher, or this is good, and that's not good, or you need to shape up, and you need to do that. Not at all. But if I look at what I'm experiencing and observing, I think there is still work for us to do. Because I observe the resilience of this faith community throughout this whole period. People showing up for meetings, even when all of us are zoomed out. You don't want to see another screen. But people show up for board meetings, for committee meetings, for services. There is still work for us to do, grounded in God's love, understanding what this is really all about. And with the faithfulness that I've observed and experienced, I look forward to what we can achieve, also with the pledges being made. I make my pledge because I'm confident and looking forward to journeying with you into the future and beginning to play more of a leadership role also in our community, of increasing our efforts and the outcome that we can be instrumental to when we are grounded in God's love and when we understand what this community is really about. I look forward to journeying with you to experience again and into the future the care that people are providing for one another in so many ways. And I look forward to journeying with you through this darkness of COVID, exacerbated by the darkness of what I feel sometimes is a political wilderness that we've been suspended into. I look forward for us, because we are grounded in God's love, to embrace the Spirit of Christ and to walk together, to be God's presence for one another and in the world. If that is lacking, that groundedness, the essential being formed and transformed by God's love and being clear on that, then all of this is really unaffordable. And I've also been taught by the COVID regime, with all the complexity and intensity that goes with it, that one should not speak too much and in too highfalutin terms, but to have a humble approach, because I'm still trying to understand what is happening with me, with myself, with those around me, with our community. And I want to say, I want to make my pledge and just simply say, I look forward to being church with you in person. On the other side of this is God's people, with my people as well. Let us be stewards of each other as well. Let us shepherd one another to truly strive to be the beloved community, grounded in God's love, illustrations, demonstrations of that love. May we be guided that way. May we strive to be that for one another, for our community, for the world. Amen.